We asked a machine to move the world so we wouldn't live in darkness, and we never stopped to think about what would be left when it finished eating. We built steel giants capable of tearing entire mountains from the Ohio soil because the nation craved light, craved warmth, craved to move forward, and when we no longer needed it, we left it to die standing upright under the open sky. We were in the years after the war. America had returned from the fields of Europe and the Pacific with a hunger it had never known before. Not just hunger for food or peace, but hunger for energy. Every expanding city, every factory opening its doors, every home installing its first electric refrigerator demanded more and more coal. Coal was the black heart pumping life through the body of the nation. And Ohio, with its vast deposits buried just beneath the surface of the ground, became the place where that heart beat loudest. Companies like Consolidation Coal Company looked at the rolling hills of eastern Ohio and saw something more than soil and trees. They saw enough fuel to keep the lights burning from Pittsburgh to Chicago, from Detroit to Cincinnati. They saw the possibility of extracting in a single day what once took weeks with men and picks descending into dark tunnels. But there was a problem. The coal seams were there, visible almost from the surface, but covering them with traditional mines meant digging tunnels, supporting ceilings, risking lives underground. The mathematics was simple and brutal. If we wanted enough coal to feed the American dream of the post-war years, we needed to tear it from the ground like someone peeling an orange. We needed strip mining. We needed machines so large they could move the landscape itself. Thus was born the idea of a beast that could walk. In the engineering workshops of Bucyrus Erie Company in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, men with pencils and slide rules began designing something that had never existed before. It was not simply a larger excavator, it was a steel building that breathed, that moved, that could take 115 cubic yards of earth and rock in a single bite and hurl them 200 feet away. To make this possible, they needed to feed the machine 13,800 volts of continuous electricity, a river of energy flowing through cables as thick as human arms. The design took years. The construction took months. When they finally assembled the first giant drag lines in the very fields of Ohio in the mid-1950s, workers looked upward and could barely believe what they had created. The steel boom extended 310 feet toward the sky, longer than an entire football field. The bucket at the end of that boom could contain enough earth to fill 2 school buses. The total weight of the machine reached 4,500 tons. There was no road that could support that weight. There was no bridge designed for such a load. That is why they gave it legs. The drag line walked. It crawled across the terrain using a system of hydraulic shoes that lifted all that metallic weight a few feet from the ground and displaced it forward in steps that made the earth tremble like small earthquakes. Children from Belmont and Harrison counties ran to see the spectacle when the beast moved from one site to another. Cows stopped grazing. Birds fled from the trees. The noise was something you would never forget if you heard it even once. It was not simply the roar of an engine, it was the deep groan of steel cables under extreme tension, the metallic screech of gears the size of kitchen tables turning against other gears, the hiss of hydraulic cylinders releasing pressure, and above all, the dull thunder when those 115 cubic yards of ancient earth struck the pile of debris growing at the side of the cut. It was a sound that traveled across 3 counties on quiet nights. The men who operated these machines were not ordinary miners. They were a new caste of workers, half engineers, half pilots, charged with controlling the dance of this giant from a control cabin that hung midway up the metal boom. Inside that cabin, surrounded by levers, gauges, switches, and windows, looking out onto an abyss they themselves were creating, these men felt something close to divine power. With the movement of one lever, they could rotate the entire superstructure 360 degrees. With another, they lowered the bucket toward the prehistoric ground. With a third, they closed the steel jaw and tore away layers of earth that had been there since before the dinosaurs walked. They lifted that weight toward the sky, turned the complete boom on the central axis, and released the load onto mountains of overburden that grew like new artificial mountain ranges. Some of these operators worked 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. They knew every vibration of the machine, every strange sound that meant something needed adjustment. They spoke of their draglines as other men spoke of their wives or their children. Big Muskie was the name of the largest of all, a beast of 13,500 tons that operated near Cumberland, built in the year 1969. But there were dozens of smaller ones scattered across southeastern Ohio. Each had its own personality, its own demands, its own good days and bad days. And when everything worked well, when the coal flowed and the piles of overburden grew beneath the midday sun, the operators felt invincible. They were feeding the country. Every ton of coal they exposed would eventually become light for 1 million homes across the Midwest. What did it matter that the hills disappeared? What did it matter that the streams diverted or that the valleys filled with sterile rocks? This was progress. This was the price of keeping America moving. And for a time, it worked gloriously. During the decades of the 60s and 70s, Ohio became one of the most important surface coal producers in the country. The economy of entire counties depended on the rhythm of these machines. Small towns like Barnesville, Cadiz, and St. Clairsville saw new money arrive. Restaurants, tool stores, mechanical workshops all prospered, feeding off the coal industry. Men who would have previously left the region seeking work in the cities could now stay, buy homes, raise families. Ohio coal fed power plants that illuminated Cleveland, Columbus, Pittsburgh. It was estimated that at its peak moment, strip mining operations in eastern Ohio contributed to generating electricity for more than 3 million homes. Local schools received funds from taxes on mineral extraction. Roads were paved. There was pride in that work. It was not the silent pride of underground miners who descended into darkness every morning, not knowing if they would return. It was a different pride, more visible, louder. It was the pride of dominating the very surface of the planet. Photographers came from national magazines to capture images of these machines working at sunset, their silhouettes cut against orange skies as they moved the equivalent of a complete house in each bucket load. Engineers from other countries visited the sites to study the American technique of large-scale strip mining. For a brief historical moment, these drag lines represented the best of human capacity to transform the natural world in service of our needs. Tourists drove for hours just to stand at the edge of an active mine and watch the mechanical ballet of earth being lifted, swung, and deposited with a precision that seemed impossible for something so massive. Families packed lunches and made it a Sunday outing, parking along county roads to witness what they called the eighth wonder of the modern world. The operators became local celebrities in their small towns, recognized at the diner, respected at church, knowing they were the masters of machines that generated more power in a single hour than 100 men could produce in a lifetime of manual labor. But giants always fall. Always. The first crack in the armor came from below, from the very communities that had prospered with coal. By the late 1970s, people began to notice what was being lost. The streams where they once fished no longer had fish. Water came from wells with an orange color oxidized by exposed minerals. The familiar hills where their grandfathers had hunted deer simply no longer existed, replaced by flat plateaus of packed earth where nothing grew. The underground aquifers that had fed springs for millennia drained or became contaminated when excavations broke the geological layers that contained them. And worst of all, the promises of land reclamation proved to be mostly empty words. The mining companies promised they would restore the landscape once extraction was complete. They would plant trees, level the terrain, return everything to its original state. But the reality was that you cannot rebuild a mountain. You cannot recreate an ecosystem that took 10,000 years to form after the last glaciation. What remained after the draglines finished their work was a lunar landscape, alienated, marked forever. The topsoil that took centuries to develop was mixed with subsoil clay and shale, creating a sterile medium where even hardy grasses struggled to take root. Fayaya, contours that once directed rainwater into natural drainage patterns, were gone, replaced by artificial slopes that eroded with every storm, sending sediment into what remained of the creek systems. Old-timers who had known the land before the machines arrived would stand at the edges of reclaimed sites and shake their heads, unable to reconcile the bland, geometric earth with the living landscape of their youth. In Washington, Congress began to listen. In 1977, they passed the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act, a federal law that for the first time imposed strict standards on how and where strip mining could be done. Companies now had to obtain detailed permits. They had to prove they could return the land to a productive state. They had to pay reclamation bonds in advance. Operating costs shot upward, but even more devastating than the new regulations was geology itself. The surface coal seams, those that could be extracted by simply removing 30 or 40 feet of overburden, were depleting. To reach the deeper layers of coal, the draglines would have to remove 100, 150, 200 feet of sterile rock. The mathematics stopped working. The coal you extracted was no longer worth what it cost to move all that earth. And there was another enemy on the horizon. Natural gas was becoming cheaper, cleaner, more politically acceptable. Power plants that had once depended entirely on Ohio coal began converting their boilers or building new facilities designed for gas from the start. The market was shifting beneath the feet of the draglines just as surely as they had shifted the earth beneath Ohio. The end came not with a dramatic explosion, but with a quiet accounting decision in boardrooms far from the mine sites. In 1991, Ohio Power Company, which had operated some of the largest draglines in the state, announced they were ceasing operations. The coal reserves that remained were too deep, too expensive, too difficult to extract profitably under the new regulatory environment. One by one, the great machines fell silent. Some were dismantled for scrap, their steel sold by the ton to be melted and reborn as rebar and beams. Others were simply abandoned in place, too massive to move economically, left to rust where they stood like fallen monuments to an age of ambition that had passed. Big Muskie, that 13,500-ton giant, operated until 1999 before it too was sentenced to death. When the cutting crews arrived with their torches to reduce it to manageable pieces, local residents came to watch, and some of them cried. They cried not because they thought strip mining was good or that the environmental destruction was justified, but because they were watching the end of an era, the death of something that had defined their lives and their landscape for nearly half a century. The bucket from Big Muskie, which could hold 220 cubic yards, was saved and placed on display in a small park near Cumberland, a relic weighing 460,000 pounds, sitting on concrete like a beached whale, offering no explanation to children who climb on it about what it once did or why it mattered. The other draglines met less ceremonious ends. Some were cut apart where they stood, the scrap hauled away in flatbed trucks over the course of months, until nothing remained but oil stains on bare rock. A few were purchased by museums or mining heritage organizations, preserved as industrial artifacts, their cabins now accessible to tourists who can sit in the operator's chair and imagine what it felt like to command such power. But most simply vanished, reduced to their constituent elements, their stories living only in the memories of the men who ran them and the people who lived in their shadows. The jobs vanished with them. Operators who had spent 20 or 30 years mastering the dance of boom and bucket found themselves middle-aged and unemployable, their skills too specialized for a world that no longer needed them. Some retrained, learning new trades, swallowing their pride to work for half their former wages. Others took early retirement, spending their remaining years watching the land slowly, imperfectly begin to heal. The towns that had boomed with coal money contracted again, stores closed, schools consolidated, young people left for opportunities elsewhere. What remained were the scars, and they are still there today. If you drive through Belmont County or Harrison County or any of the southeastern counties of Ohio, you will see them. The artificial hills that look wrong somehow, too smooth, too regular, covered with uniform grass that lacks the diversity of natural meadows. The strange flat plateaus where mountains once stood, the ponds that formed in old excavation sites, their water too acidic to support much life, reflecting the sky like blind eyes staring upward. The land remembers what we did to it. The land keeps the record of our hunger and our haste, even as we try to forget. Some of the reclaimed sites have found new purposes. A few became parks, their trails winding across reshaped earth, while interpretive signs explain what used to be here. Others became industrial sites themselves, warehouses and distribution centers built on the level ground that the draglines created. A handful became lakes where people fish and boat, apparently untroubled by the fact that these bodies of water exist only because we removed everything that was there before. But most of the old mine sites simply sit there, growing weeds and scrub pine, waiting for something or someone to give them meaning again. The silence in those places is profound. If you stand where a dragline once worked and close your eyes, you can almost hear it still. That deep mechanical groan that shook the air. That sound of absolute certainty that we were doing the right thing, the necessary thing, the thing that progress demanded. And then you open your eyes and see only emptiness, and you wonder what we were so certain about. We told ourselves we needed the energy to build a nation, to light homes, to power factories, to keep the great machine of American prosperity running. And we did need it. That part was true. The coal that came from those Ohio hills did light millions of homes. It did power the industrial heartland. It did help build the second half of the American century. But we never asked what the full price would be. We never calculated what it would cost, not just in dollars, but in mountains that would never be mountains again, in streams that would run orange for generations, in communities that would be left behind when the coal ran out, or the regulations changed, or the economics shifted. We built machines that could move heaven and earth, and we used them without restraint because we believed that progress was always worth its price and that someone, somehow, would figure out how to fix whatever we broke. We were wrong about that. Some things, once broken, cannot be fixed. Some prices, once paid, cannot be refunded. The draglines are gone now, almost all of them, reduced to memory and museum pieces, and that one massive bucket sitting in a small Ohio park. The men who operated them are retiring or passing on, taking with them the knowledge of what it felt like to control such power. The landscape they altered will outlive us all, a permanent testament to an age when we believed we could reshape the world without consequence. Perhaps that was the real story. Not the triumph of engineering or the tragedy of destruction, but the human tale of wanting something desperately, taking it without understanding the cost, and living with what we had done long after the wanting passed. The coal remains beneath Ohio, but we will never go after it with draglines again. That age is finished. What remains is the question we should have asked before we ate the mountains. Was it worth it? If you grew up in the shadow of these machines, if you remember the sound or the pride or the fear, if you see the scars in the land where you played, tell us. The only way we learn is to remember honestly and carry that truth forward into whatever we choose to do next.